Well, welcome everybody. I'd like to start by saying how privileged I feel to be giving this A.T. Still Memorial Lecture. Look back through its history and it's quite storied. I want to start out by saying, it's a privilege for me because I'm a second generation osteopathic physician. My father is a unique guy who taught at Kansas City University, as it is now, back in the 40s. And at that time, he had a PhD in microbiology from Western Reserve University, the university where I teach right now. And so it's kind of a twist coming around. And my daughter, who's a third generation osteopath, a proud graduate of OU-HCOM, now has a campus that sits on the Cleveland Clinic healthcare system. So this is quite an honor. I'm going to talk about the role of osteopathic medicine in pandemics, and I'm going to reflect on the flu epidemic of 1918. But I want to first ground set. A pandemic is an infectious disease that is widespread, but we now use it to really talk about global spread of diseases. It can be a re-emerging disease like influenza, which re-emerges year after year, season after season, northern, southern hemisphere. Or it can be newly emerging, such as HIV in 1980 or COVID-19 this year, which I'll wind up talking about. Pandemics are really the byproduct of civilization. It's people started living together. They were no longer hunter-gatherers and had livestock and mixing of crowds and animals and people, and zoonotic infections led to disease. We can look at pandemics through the ages, and this kind of proportionality graph over here shows some interesting findings. I show Stephen Hawking's because before he died, he said he predicted that the end of civilization will come in the next millennia due to an infectious disease. And he refined that. He said in 1,000 years. And before he died, he said, I think it could be 100 years. So think about that for a second. The 1918 flu epidemic, which is shown here with this green proportionality, is believed to have killed more people on the planet than any other pandemic, including the Great Plague of the Middle Ages, though it proportionally killed more individuals. And today, COVID-19, while pale, thankfully, compared to these great pandemics, is a warning shot across our bow. So in the next few minutes, I'll talk about the great influenza pandemic, the role of osteopathic medicine, the evolution of medicine in general and osteopathic medicine, and then COVID-19. Then I'm going to challenge you as the leaders of this profession, of what you can do and what the threats are if you don't. So this is the A.T. Still lecture, and Dr. Still was quite a unique character, and an original thinker, if there ever was one, who back in the late 19th century was disgruntled with the standards of, quote, modern medicine. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the physician, said at that time, if you took all the medicines in our pharmacopoeia and threw them in the ocean, it would be worse off for the fishes and better off for man. He had different ideas: structural, functional medicine, natural healing, holistic approach to medicine. And he took a lot of flack and stood by his guns. On the right, the iconic Sir William Osler, and I show here on the lower right an article that 15 years ago I wrote about Sir William Osler and A.T. Still, comparing and contrasting their times. And while they never met, they had a few things in common. They both eschewed the medicines of the day. Osler is an intensely evidence-based man, wrote the leading textbook of medicine for over 40 years. He knew that we didn't have data on how to use them, and he had great doubts as to their efficacy used in a willy-nilly fashion. In 1918, the epidemic of flu broke out quietly. It's actually not known where this flu epidemic started, but there are data pointing to Haskell County, Kansas. It had proximity to Army bases that were disembarking points for people training for World War I, and that is complicit. As I say, transmission was exacerbated by this. Crowded people, crowded ships. It was called the Spanish flu because Spain was a neutral country. And in all other countries, knowledge and information regarding this flu was suppressed by the press. In Spain, it was talked about widely. They said, oh, it's a Spanish flu. Clinically, I will point out to you, as we probably all recognize, this was something far beyond what was known about influenza, although many people continued to refer to it, as the French would say, la grippe. It's just the flu, and it was far from it. So that's kind of a familiar statement today, right? The clinical features of this disease were one of extraordinarily rapid onset. People could be well in the morning and dead by the next day. It seems kind of almost counterintuitive. There are descriptions of people who boarded a train headed for Washington. And by the time that train got there, there were a number of people dead that were seemingly okay when they boarded. People died pneumonic deaths, and that is likely due to a combination of direct viral pneumonitis, complicated ARDS, a clinical diagnosis, and a major proportion, we don't know how much, of secondary bacterial pneumonia, because this was the pre-antimicrobial era. And people had a good idea of the epidemiology of it. Public health people said, you know, physical distancing, wear masks. It was kind of a deja vu all over again of what the public response was in certain areas versus other areas. And while the epi was known, the etiology was not. This was kind of the dawn of when we started to understand the immune system. Emil von Behring won the first Nobel Prize in medicine for serotherapy. We started to understand the principle of antibodies, though they really weren't defined. Microbiology was growing, but viruses were only known as filterable microbes at that time. If we look at the treatments of the day, I'm showing you the conservative therapies. There certainly was no known cure, and there were no antimicrobials, but we did have medicines. Acetylsalicylic acid, epinephrine, oxygen, which was tried in vain, digitalis, quinine, hydrotherapy, even open air therapy, which was probably the best risk benefit of all of these therapies, and a myriad of quack therapies, some that were very frightening to think about. So in the midst of this, osteopathic medicine was fledgling. Osteopaths had in their toolbox manipulative therapy and whatever the standards of the day were. And it is well known that osteopaths did care for patients with influenza. And it has become kind of a popular sport in osteopathic medicine over the past several decades to estimate or guesstimate what the contributions of osteopathic medicine were in that influenza epidemic. And much has been written about this. And this is really not the focus of my talk. I find it very interesting. Dr. Kendrick Smith in 1918 at the annual meeting of the AOA had done a study that suggested that 1/14 of the mortality was experienced by patients who saw osteopathic physicians versus allopathic physicians. as a person who studies epidemiology of safety of biologic therapeutics, I have a lot of difficulty with that studies. And in 2007, Sanderlin and my friend John Lechardon wrote a very authoritative and balanced critique of that study. And there may have been benefit over and above allopathic medicine. Certainly, we had better risk benefits with manipulative therapy than willy-nilly use of drugs or quackery. But I'm here to say that there was clear evidence of dedication and signs of engagement and commitment of the osteopathic profession. And we're never really going to know what the real data is. But we were all in at that time, and I want you to hold on to that thought. So what's happened in the last 100 years? A beautiful narrative from the New England Journal from just a couple of years ago by Green and Loscalzo, wonderful scholars of medical thinking, have pointed out that medicine has changed, through the ages, from the earliest 18th century, winding without physical diagnosis, to the stethoscope, to the microbial era of Koch and Pasteur, to identifying lesions with laboratory tests and histology, until now the age of precision medicine. We've actually deconstructed the individual, and much to the betterment of having molecular therapies available for those who stand to benefit from them, the few that stand to benefit from them. In that article, I found this quote, and I always show this when I talk about medical humanism in the medical schools or at lectures such as this. They said, the holistic vision of network medicine, this molecular medicine, is dependent on a field of atomized parts, including genes, proteins, digital data, computational infrastructure, yet with an appreciation of these limitations and a sustained commitment to what is being rendered invisible. And they called for what we recognize as the imperative of a biosocial approach to medicine. I think that was actually lost in this article, but it hit me right between the eyes, and I want you to think about that. So fast forward the osteopathic profession from AT Still to what we have today. This is a molecular world we live in. My daughter now works in my immunology center as a immunologist and infectious disease practitioner, and is practicing, state-of-the-art precision medicine as an exemplar of an osteopath. We have over 120,000 practitioners, all the things that you guys know as much as we have been committed to. We're pioneers in understanding the importance of holistic medicine, and I will comment later about our role in understanding the role of empathic communication and empathy in healing. I can't underestimate this. Now let's change gears and talk about COVID-19. We're now in a new pandemic, an emerging pandemic, not a re-emerging pandemic. The virus is known, SARS-CoV-2, how it got here is inconsequential. We had premonitions of this from SARS and MERS that this could happen, but it happened now in an inconceivable way as a global pandemic. I made this slide just a few days ago. There are now over 35 million cases, over 1 million deaths. The United States leads in deaths per capita, an embarrassment of riches. How did we get here? What is our role? What is our future? Or what I'd like to reflect on as we move ahead. Clinically, this disease is much different than the influenza of 1918. 90% of people get better, 10% of people get sick, and we've identified risk factors: age, race, morbid obesity, diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, etc. Most people do quite well with this illness, but those that don't have a high rate of ICU admission and a high rate of death. We're trying to understand the fusion of an immunologic and infectious disease, and more to come on that in the next few months. The horrors of COVID-19 are palpable. There are mass graves. This is a picture from Tuscany. This is not different from the Middle Ages. And New York City at one time looked like a ghost city. There's been a lack of confidence in leadership and an erosion, a almost fatalistic erosion of our belief in science, which is truly frightening. I have the strongest recommendation. I edit a publication called Helio-Rheumatology, and I always give book reviews. I'm about to review this book. This is a cautionary tale. John Barry wrote this book in 2006. It has been making the rounds among ID and immunology people this year. It's a must read. He has a postscript to it. A quote from this said, "Society cannot function if it is every man for himself, i.e. in a pandemic. By definition, civilization cannot survive that. Those in authority must retain the public's trust. The way to do that is distort nothing, put the best face on nothing, and try to manipulate no one." So think of that in your roles of leadership and where your voice and your ear is in this current pandemic. So I'd like to close by providing you a SWOT analysis of where my vision of the osteopathic profession is. I'm speaking as an osteopath. I'm speaking as an ID physician, as an immunologist, a person doing research in COVID-19 and participating in vaccine trials. So what are our strengths? We are highly trained, highly skilled, dedicated for caring to the sick and preservation and the enhancements of health. We are second to no one. Our patients place trust in our judgment and our recommendations for themselves and their loved ones. We're a strong and diverse collective with broad geographic reach. In comparing osteopathic medicine now to when my father ventured into this about 1940, it's totally unrecognizable. We have weaknesses, and I say this because honesty is part of the equation of a SWOT analysis. We, like everyone, are challenged by the tsunami of activity and content of the news hole to get our message out. You know, we're just a little part of this global medical establishment, and sometimes it seems like we're not heard. Even though now the president's personal physician is an osteopathic physician, I stand with him. I've been tweeting in support of him. He has a very, very tough job that I wouldn't want to be doing. I think we need to use our social media. Any of you out there, you should be following me on Twitter and supporting this. So that's a lighthearted part of this. A second weakness is that I think, I've been in this business now for 45 years. We're so well accepted and blended in with the general medical community that our identity is sometimes overlooked. I mean, I think of myself as a healer, and as an osteopath. But we are, in certain parts, victims of our own success. Then the last point is that, our output in terms of research, this is not the orientation of our community, yet we engage in research, and I'll come back to this. And our recognition of public education may ideally be stronger. And I'll point out some ways that I think that we can do this with our resources. The opportunities are large. We can and must stand up for science in these confusing times in the domains of care, research, and education. We have to be up there with every creditable organization saying that we cannot get out of this epidemic or the next epidemic without scientific guidance. There's no equivocation on this. And that we must be leaders in preventive care. If we're truly holistic, we must maintain the ethos that prevention is a primary goal and objective. And thus, I think that we can stand taller for vaccine advocacy. There's a lot of going on in the vaccine world, and it's not good. A recent U of M poll showed that almost 50% of parents are very likely to have their children immunized for flu, only 50%. And only 1/3 believe it's more important this year. They fear side effects. Half say their provider strongly recommended. The other half say it wasn't strongly recommended. Recent book given great press, the Academy of Science, Paul Offit commented on this by Dr. Berman, who's a basic science faculty at Osteopathic College of Medicine in Arkansas. So we have a lot going on here to stand up for science and stand up to the anti-vaxxers. It's a very important and should be a visible part of our biology. I think we have opportunities. You can't do this on an ad hoc basis. I think that you should demand that some form of task force and campaign be established to promote what is going to happen in the next 3 months. People keep asking me, what about the vaccine? When is it coming? What are we going to do? I'm not sure right now, but I better be poised to answer that question. I'm on a international workshop in a few weeks with a member of the ACIP and vaccine immunobiology and the American College of Rheumatology. AOA should be well poised and to be able to sort through this data rapidly, including colleges of medicine, constituent societies, members, publication, and events. Don't wait till the first vaccine comes out. Be proactive. I love this. This is from the Infectious Disease Society of America, their national meeting last year. My daughter, who spoke at this national meeting, brought this back. She said, you know, Dad, they're so into vaccines, you know, that people will come up and write on this wall why they vaccinate, why they're giving their flu shot. The hashtag on their Twitter is why I vaccinate. We as an organization can take the high road and support vaccination. And I'm not talking about COVID vaccine right now. I'm talking about influenza vaccine. If there's ever a time that's necessary, it's right now. Finally, we have this opportunity to further our work in osteopathic empathy through the vision of the AOA and the support of the AOA and the support of ACOM. This POMI project has come to fruition after 5 years, and publications have been numerous, including a publication in Academic Medicine, the voice of the AAMC. I do not envision a cure for cancer or Alzheimer's disease coming out of a laboratory in an osteopathic college of medicine. But I will tell you that it is within the reach of the osteopathic profession to develop the cure for what's ailing the soul of medicine. I'm disappointed to see the POMI project not funded through the next cycle. This is an extraordinary contribution you've made already. I challenge you to re-examine this. The threats to us is being overwhelmed. There's over 70,000 articles that have been written since March of this year. You need curation for the primary care physician and frontline osteopath. Doing nothing is a threat. And finally, I close with this, is that, you know, I agree with Bill Gates. We're not ready for this pandemic, and we're certainly not ready for the next pandemic, but I have faith in the osteopathic profession, and I know this is a wake-up call for all of you. We stand in your service, so thank you again for this great honor.
Hello, everyone. I want to first start by saying thank you for the invitation by Dr. Burns and Dr. Ely to deliver this year's A.T. Still Memorial Lecture. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. Dr. Still emphasized the important philosophy of treating patients in their totality. The underlying principle of osteopathic medicine is that the body is one unit of function based on connection between the mind, body, and spirit. This approach is more applicable today than ever as we are navigating uncharted territories during this difficult time. The current pandemic has had an effect on so many people's lives, both directly and indirectly. Direct from the standpoint of the acute illness on the individual patient, and indirect from the consequences of the pandemic on non-infected individuals. The greatest direct consequence has been loss of life. Others include acquired complications of the illness, such as stroke or heart attack. Less talked about, but just as important and often difficult to manage, are the emotional and psychological effects of the illness on the patient. Indirect effects include the loss of loved ones, the inability to take care of family due to loss of job or limitations in income, anxiety, and simply fear of the unknown. It is difficult not to be able to gather with family or hold the hand of a dying parent or grandparent. The consequences of such emotional trauma are lifelong and often unerasable. In addition, the treatment of ongoing illnesses or the diagnosis of other acute conditions were also missed. This may be due to people either being afraid to go to the hospital or those whose scheduled surgeries or workups were put on hold due to the pandemic. This pandemic has certainly provided the opportunity to remind us of many valuable lessons. I believe, first and foremost, it has forced us to see just how vulnerable we really are and how life can change so much and so fast. We all experience going from normal day-to-day routines to staying at home and sheltering in place as things were being figured out. This pandemic has also brought to light some of the shortcomings of our healthcare system. Some centers had difficulty keeping up with personal protective equipment for their staff, or were concerned that they may not have enough resources to handle the surge of patients and the increased pandemic-associated workload. One of the things in particular that I believe made dealing with this pandemic more challenging is the fact that it is due to a novel organism. It is hard to find an illness where not much is known about the cause and/or the illness itself. So what do we know about the current pandemic? First off, I feel it is important to emphasize that the knowledge we have now regarding this pandemic is continuously evolving and changing on a daily basis. At the start, we knew very little about how it spread, the level of contagion, and who was at the highest risk for infection. This lack of knowledge greatly influenced both our concern for and our response to the virus. Certainly what we know today is very different than what we knew originally only months ago during the initial outbreak. The coronavirus disease 2019 is known as COVID-19. It is caused by the novel severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. Coronaviruses are large, enveloped, single-stranded RNA viruses which are found in humans and other mammals. Most coronaviruses result in mild illness, but 3, including the SARS coronavirus 2, have resulted in severe disease in humans. The virus gains entry into cells through the respiratory tract. It uses the host cell machinery to replicate itself. In turn, various cell lines become infected within the pulmonary system, resulting in an inflammatory response, which over time can lead to pulmonary edema and acute respiratory distress syndrome. Progression of disease can cause multi-system organ failure and thrombotic complications such as pulmonary embolism, myocardial infarction, and stroke. It is believed that the transmission of infections occurs primarily through respiratory droplets, most likely in circumstances with associated close person-to-person proximity and prolonged exposure. Although the virus has been found on a variety of surfaces, the clinical significance of that with respect to transmission of infection is not well understood. The clinical manifestations of COVID-19 for the majority of patients are mild in severity and includes fever, cough, dyspnea, fatigue, myalgias, and nausea, vomiting, or diarrhea. Hospitalized patients often have comorbidities such as hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney, pulmonary, or liver diseases. The diagnosis of COVID-19 is often made by performing COVID-19 nucleic acid-based testing of nasopharyngeal swab. The performance characteristics of this testing method is dependent in part by specimen source and time from exposure. Laboratory abnormalities, although non-specific, are frequent in hospitalized patients and can include elevated inflammatory markers, lymphopenia, low albumin, elevated liver enzymes, and abnormalities of coagulation tests. Chest X-ray findings can be variable, but often include multifocal peripheral and lower lobe predominant consolidation or multifocal rounded opacities and nodules. For most patients, the current treatment of COVID-19 is in large part supportive, with close attention to the respiratory status. It is amazing to see how some patients tolerate hypoxemia well and have no significant respiratory distress. Hypoxemia is managed with supplemental oxygen and, in deteriorating situations, with mechanical ventilation. Treatment strategies have revolved around targeting the virus as well as the host and minimizing associated complications of the disease, such as thromboembolic conditions. Investigated therapeutics have included antivirals, antibodies, anti-inflammatory and immunomodulatory agents, anticoagulants, and antifibrotic therapy. A few points about therapeutics are relevant to mention. It is important to emphasize that in an evolving pandemic, life-saving therapies are in dire need. It is not necessarily practical to withhold potential treatments while awaiting the conduction of large-scale randomized clinical trials. Potential initial therapies may emerge from in vitro studies, trials from non-randomized clinical trials, or small-scale randomized clinical trials. In converse, over time, non-randomized clinical trials that may have pointed towards potential therapies may not end up showing benefit in well-conducted randomized clinical trials. Proper timing of the therapeutics is also another important factor when we contemplate treatment agents. Some therapies may be more suitable in the earlier stages of the disease, while some may be indicated in later stages, and others are used for reducing complications. The issue will become clearer as we continue to learn more about the disease pathophysiology, the natural course of the disease, and the associated complications. Vaccine trials are underway, but this is certainly a challenging task. The challenge not only includes developing an effective vaccine, but also what is the best target that provokes protective antibodies, the need for adjuvant therapy, the uncertainty of duration of immunity, and the ability to mass produce and distribute the vaccine to the public. For now, we as healthcare providers are standing on the front line managing patients with COVID with what we currently know. The spectrum of disease in patients presenting for care is varied, but a common theme that exists among most COVID patients is the anxiety and the unknown about the prognosis and the future. Although it seems that the younger population is not affected to the same degree compared to the older adults, we cannot ignore the impact on children and young adults. School and university closures, and in general, disruption of their routine and structures have their own negative consequences. As healthcare providers, we should remember not just to concentrate on the physical consequences of COVID on our patients. Most COVID patients will end up with mild symptoms not requiring any intervention, hospitalizations, or acute complications. However, the psychosocial significance of illness to the patient and their family members is consequential. We should be mindful in thinking holistically about each patient. In addition, as members of a team providing patient care, there are many others that deserve recognition in this complex and challenging time. The same holistic approach taken with our patients should also be mirrored when interacting with our team members in the healthcare force. Everyone plays a role, and we should be cognizant and appreciative of their hard work and effort. The emotional toll of the pandemic on healthcare workers should be recognized. It is important to be mindful of what everyone is going through, and we should not forget to be helpful and considerate to one another. In conclusion, remember the core philosophy of osteopathic medicine. Body is one unit of function based on the connection between the mind, body, and spirit. It is important to maintain this holistic approach not only in the care of your patients, but also in the interactions with your coworkers and in your own lives. Thank you.